Just waiting for our YouTube live stream to load as the audience filters in. All right, well, we are now live on YouTube and live here on Zoom, so I can see that the audience is filtering in. I will go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kobe Rizik, and I am the former student president of the Buckley program. I'm excited to welcome all of you to our firing line debate on nuclear power, where we will be debating the proposition resolved: a U.S. nuclear renaissance is needed and affordable. With the new president and a Democratic Congress that are both committed to addressing climate change, as well as the growing bipartisan support for decarbonizing America's electricity grid, as demonstrated, for example, by the comprehensive and Republican-backed energy bill of 2020, the future of nuclear power generation could not be more relevant today. I'm greatly looking forward to engaging with our guests about the risks and benefits associated with expanding nuclear's role in America's energy system. Before I introduce our guest this afternoon, I want to say a few words about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We host lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, as well as an annual conference. Our over 350 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program forwards its mission of a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives, including those of the right, must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program as well as how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. I'd also like to take the opportunity to recognize the over 100 Buckley Fellows who are graduating next month. It's been an honor to have been a fellow personally, as well as a board member and president of the program while at Yale. And I know many others share the same sincere gratitude for all of the opportunities provided by the Buckley program over the past several years. As a fellow, I've made new friends, met politicians, judges, journalists, and writers. But most importantly, I've built a network that shares a common belief in the necessity of intellectual diversity. So here's to the Buckley class of 2021, all of whom have participated in and strengthened an invaluable institution at Yale, one that I've been very grateful to be a part of for the past 4 years. Now on to our guest today. Michael Shellenberger is Time Magazine Hero of the Environment, Green Book Award winner, and the founder and president of Environmental Progress. He's been called an environmental guru, climate guru, North America's leading public intellectual on clean energy, and high priest of the environmental humanist movement for his writings and TED Talks, which have been viewed over 5 million times. Shellenberger advises policymakers around the world, including in the US, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, the UK, the Netherlands, and Belgium. In January of 2020, Shellenberger testified before the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology in the U.S. House of Representatives. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, invited Michael in 2019 to serve as an independent expert reviewer of its next assessment report, which I believe will be AR6. Dr. Matthew McKenzie, our next guest, is the Senior Director for Planning and Operations and the Director of the Nuclear, Climate, and Clean Energy Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. At the NRDC, Dr. McKenzie directs planning and operations for NRDC's climate and clean energy advocacy in the United States. Since joining NRDC in 1997, he has worked on nuclear policy and the environment and applying geospatial analysis to NRDC's mission. Dr. McKenzie holds a PhD in experimental nuclear physics from the University of Pennsylvania, was a postdoctoral associate at Cornell University's Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies, and served on NRDC sabbatical appointment at the Department of Defense on wind energy and military radar systems. Just a brief note regarding the format of today's debate. I'll have each of our guests start with 5 to 10 minute opening statements, after which both of our guests will then have 5 minutes to respond to each other. I'll then move into questions from myself as well as you, our audience. I encourage you to submit throughout the event using the Q&A feature that you can find on the lower panel of the Zoom window. At the end, I'll be sure to give each guest 2 minutes to offer closing remarks, and this event will conclude at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. With that, please join me in welcoming Michael Schellenberger and Matthew McKenzie virtually to Yale and to the Buckley program. Mr. Schellenberger, are you on yet? Okay, sorry for the technical difficulties. It looks like Mr. Schellenberger is in the audience raising his hand. Mr. Schellenberger, you should be a panelist now. You can turn your camera on.
There's no option to do that. Oh.
Just one moment. Mr. Schellenberger, you can go ahead and continue with your opening statement. And while you're doing that, I can work to try to see if we can get your camera on.
Okay, I had slides I was going to show too. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. I think that you should be a panelist, but for some reason you are on as an attendee right now. So I need to look at how I can promote you to panelist possibly.
Okay, let me try to come back in.
Sorry, everybody, for the slight delay. There, I can see you now.
I think I got put in the wrong room or something. Can you see me now?
Yes, perfectly.
So you just need to enable.
Good afternoon, Michael.
You just need to enable screen sharing. Do you know how to do that? There it is. Perfect. So should I just dive right in? Can you see this?
Yes, feel free. I think people can see.
Awesome. And I have you said I should take 5 or 10 minutes?
Yes, 5 or 10 minutes is perfect.
Okay. Let's start with the issue that everybody worries about. Is nuclear power safe? It turns out we've studied nuclear power really closely for decades. In fact, we've studied radiation, which is the main thing that you worry about with nuclear power, since Marie Curie and her husband, Pierre, started experimenting with radiation. It's really amazing. Radiation's amazing. In fact, we know how much of the body works because we attach radioactive particles to different parts of our body to see how it works. So we know a lot about radiation. This is the best available peer-reviewed scientific study that has been done recently on deaths from different major sources of energy, reliable sources of energy, and nuclear comes out the lowest. About Chernobyl, that's the one everybody worried about. When I was a kid, Chernobyl happened when I was 15. It was terrifying. We had just been terrified by this made-for-TV movie about nuclear war, which various environmental groups were supporting. And then we were made to watch this movie about we were made to watch also about Chernobyl. Is terrifying, but it turns out some firefighters died right away from acute radiation syndrome, another 15 total deaths from thyroid cancer. The best available science from the United Nations is at most 200 deaths over an 80-year period. Don't take my word for it, just go read the UN reports. I describe them all in my book, Apocalypse Never. And it's all online. You can talk to Jerry Thomas, who works in Imperial College London and runs the Chernobyl tissue bank. She's the world expert. To give you some perspective, the worst accident, energy accident, was a renewable accident. The Banqiao Dam collapsed and killed almost 250,000 people. But more people die from a pipeline exploding in South San Francisco or from Deepwater Horizon than died at 3 Mile Island or Fukushima. So, I mean, that's a pretty remarkable industrial accident of any kind where nobody dies. And yet that's what's occurred at Fukushima and 3 Mile Island. We know 7 million deaths annually from air pollution, according to the World Health Organization. My friend, the climate scientist, James Hansen, points out that nuclear power has actually saved nearly 2 million lives today just by preventing the burning of fossil fuels. The United States right now, just to put in perspective, we're the global climate leader. The main reason is fracking for natural gas, which NRDC opposed, but it actually reduced US emissions more than any other country in the world over the last 20 years. US emissions went down 22% below 2005 levels compared to 17%, which is what they would have gone down under had we implemented cap and trade. But our promises, our global promises, were 17% below 2005. We reduced them 22%. And yes, there was a pandemic last year, but the difference was marginal, insignificant. We still would be the largest. We're close to peak emissions globally. This is who we are. We're totally independent research organization. We publicly disclose all of our donors. We accept no funding from industry. I consult to policymakers around the world. My book, which came out last summer, is a bestseller. It's being translated into 17 languages. All the research I'll show you can be found on our website. These were the praise for Apocalypse Never. The world's leading climate scientist, Tom Wigley, said it may be the most important book on the environment ever written. The former CEO of Nature Conservancy is a book broadly praised on both left and right. And, you know, I lay out basically things have been going really well on a big picture perspective. Extreme poverty has declined from 44% to 10%. Life expectancy globally has risen from 40 to 70%. We're having fewer and fewer kids just by moving to the city. We produce so much food. It's shocking. Like all of you, I'm sure, struggle with too much food. We've never produced bigger food surpluses in the world. And no scientific study suggests that that number will go down. Even with high levels of warming, irrigation, fertilizer, tractors are the key to growing a lot of food. And everybody knows that. There's no prediction of increased starvation from climate change. Energy consumption is the key. Yeah, Germany reduced its energy consumption a little bit, but they're still using a lot more energy than India, Indonesia, and Vietnam. The claims of radical emissions reductions from energy efficiency that have been made by NRDC and other groups are just irresponsible and proven wrong through decades of empirical analysis. Deaths from natural disasters are going down. Other problems are obviously much more serious in the United States. We're in the drug abuse epidemic. Extreme weather was about 400, just to put things in perspective on terms of climate change. Far more people, nobody's predicting, by the way, nobody at IPCC, no climate scientists, nobody's predicting more deaths from extreme weather, okay? Nobody. We're just getting so much more resilient at it. That's why most people see drug addiction as a bigger problem than climate change. What happened in Texas is a warning that you can't, if you're worried about extreme weather events, whether hot or cold, you can't rely more on weather-dependent energy. Like my great, kids in elementary school understand this point. So wind produced 2% of its capacity during the blackouts. The worst one of the blackouts, nuclear plants produced 73%. There's this misinformation that somehow there was a similar performance by different energy sources. I mentioned before, we reduced our carbon emissions more than we would have had we passed the cap and trade legislation that NRDC wrote and advocated for. We can see at a global level, the only thing that really matters is nuclear power. Look at the countries in green. These are nuclear heavy countries and states. We spend about the same amount of money on solar and wind as we spent on nuclear, but we got twice as much energy out of the nuclear. Just look at France and Germany. You have to look at countrywide scales. France gets over twice as much of its electricity from carbon-free sources as Germany. They produce 1/10 of the carbon emissions in France, 1/10 of the carbon emissions as in France as they do in Germany. So Germany produces 10 times more emissions per unit of energy. California, everybody thinks it's a huge amount of solar electricity. We actually produce more solar than we need. We have to pay Arizona to take it. And then it doesn't produce power when we most need it, which is at peak hours when people come home from work and turn everything on in their house. As a result of all of the solar, our electricity prices rose 7 times more than in the rest of the United States. Same thing happened in Germany. Their prices rose 50%. As a result, German electricity is almost twice as expensive as French electricity. So it's a myth that you have to raise the price of energy to radically reduce carbon emissions. You just have to use nuclear power. That's all. That's the only thing that really matters. The batteries in our phones, these lithium batteries, are prohibitively expensive. There's just nobody even thinks that we're going to use batteries to back up. The blackouts in California that we experienced last year were fundamentally driven by an over-reliance on weather-dependent renewables, namely solar. And the reason that occurred is because the Public Utilities Commission which is heavily influenced by NRDC, did not purchase enough gas, and they shut down the nuclear plant. NRDC had fought to shut down the nuclear plants in California, and they got their way. And as a result, we had blackouts last year. And this is the CEO of the electrical grid saying this, okay? And when you go to a blackout situations like we had in California, people die, okay? This is serious stuff. We shut, NRDC, Jerry Brown, California Public Utilities Commission shut down the nuclear plant in San Onofre, carbon emissions went up, and now we're getting blackouts from it. According to the CEO of the grid, he said, we warned the PUC repeatedly and they rebuffed us. Why did they rebuff them? Because NRDC was there reassuring the PUC that they didn't need nuclear. They didn't need natural gas. They could just power all of California on solar panels and batteries. NRDC has been fear-mongering about nuclear waste for decades. As an environmentalist, this is what you want. All of the energy I need in my entire life can come from this amount of uranium, and at the end of the process, it's safely stored in places that has never, ever hurt anybody and never will, as opposed to destroying mountaintops, covering deserts and killing desert tortoises with renewables. Solar panels produce 300 times more waste than nuclear plants, and we have no solution for them. They're going right into landfills, and people are being exposed to heavy metals, including lead. We now know that these cheap solar panels, they became cheap through the use of enslaved labor. We now know that the Uyghur Muslims were offered concentration camps or to work at solar panel factories in China. They were warning of this for years. It finally made the New York Times. We know that solar sunlight is too dilute to power a society. That's why Blade Runner, which was even better than the predecessor, they show the dystopia of what it would look like to try to power a society on solar panels. The model was this farm, Ivanpah, an ecological disaster. Requires 400 times more land to generate the same amount of electricity from solar as it does from nuclear. But NRDC is trying to shut down the one on the right and build more of the one on the left, even though it's massive impacts on the environment. We saw biologists speak out to the most important progressive environmental magazine, talking about their trauma of having to kill baby desert tortoises, which are a critically endangered species, to build that solar farm. It's a scandal. We know nuclear is safe. The New Yorker did a beautiful and very balanced piece for that magazine, which is very anti-nuclear, about myself and the grassroots pro-nuclear movement around the world. This is what it means to save the environment. There is zero pollution coming out of this plant. NRDC fabricated misinformation in the 60s, suggesting that the warm water that came out of this plant somehow had an effect on sea life. And they've used that as an excuse to try to shut down all of our nuclear plants. In fact, it's abundant with sea life. The sea lions and the seals, they come close to the plant because they like that warm water, just like we do. It's abundant with fish. There's no evidence that's had any negative impact. It's probably had a positive one. Those who see nuclear for what it truly is, which is the only way to lift everybody out of poverty while reducing our environmental impact to zero. We're small now. I don't have the $100 million a year that NRDC gets from natural gas companies and solar panel makers. I don't have that resource, but we're small and we're telling the honest truth about energy and the environment against the misinformation of groups like NRDC, Sierra Club, Jerry Brown, and Governor Gavin Newsom for the last 50 years. Thanks so much for inviting me to participate. It's a very important conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Schellenberger. Dr. McKenzie, you can begin your opening statements whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me all right? We had some technical challenges earlier.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, thank you. Finding a best nuclear energy policy, it's a hard problem. It's really a great debate. Why is that? The nuclear problem, it lies at the intersection of energy and economic policy, climate change in the environment, homeland security, and national security. I did my PhD in nuclear physics. I've always felt a sense of wonder about the atomic nucleus. I'm an environmentalist. On nuclear energy, I'm a pragmatist. I want to know what tools will work to address the problem of climate change and provide reliable, affordable electricity. So let me start with our proposition, which is a US nuclear renaissance is needed and affordable. If a huge growth of new nuclear in the US is needed and affordable, well, then we have a ready resource to apply to our problems. But if a US nuclear renaissance is not needed, we have a choice based on affordability and risk reduction and resource allocation. My position in today's debate is a US nuclear renaissance is not affordable, and lots of new nuclear isn't needed to address the climate threat or for reliable power generation. Nevertheless, nuclear energy is an important issue, and we still must make reasoned choices about nuclear policy for our future. So let me start with the affordability of nuclear energy. We have 53 years of experience generating electricity from nuclear power in the US to think about. For some of you new to this topic, that story might not be what you expect. In the 70s and 80s, the US built about 100 of what are called Generation 2 reactors, pressurized water, boiling water reactors, most of which are operating today. These are the existing nuclear reactors, not part of the US nuclear renaissance we're debating, but our current context. For the last 25 years, about half of the nuclear era, that US nuclear capacity has been astonishingly constant, about 100 gigawatts. A few reactor closures were balanced by power uprates. One new nuclear reactor came online. Many plants eventually ran almost 24/7, high capacity factors, 90% or above, a remarkable number. Nuclear waste was produced and stockpiled at reactor sites, over 70,000 metric tons. Why weren't more nuclear plants built in the last 25 years? Well, we learned about the high costs of nuclear and nuclear risk. In fact, in the US, we've canceled more reactor projects than we ever built. So today, 28 states have nuclear power plants, most east of the Mississippi River. Right now, the average age of these plants is 40 years. That's getting old for a nuclear plant. Operations costs go up, major components may need replacement. That cuts into cost competitiveness with renewables and natural gas. And so we're starting to see nuclear plant retirements. In some cases, the retirement was about botched repairs. San Onofre or Songs in California, Crystal River in Florida are examples. In most cases, it's about poor economics. 10 reactors have closed and 5 more reactors are scheduled to shut down before 2025. What's the average age of retirement for a nuclear plant? So far, 42.6 years. So what we're seeing is those decades of nuclear steady state are changing. Nuclear energy is slowly trending downwards in the US. In response, 5 states are offering carbon subsidies to uneconomic nuclear plants: Illinois, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, and Yale State of Connecticut. But all of this begs the question, if some existing nuclear plants in competitive power markets are in trouble economically, can we afford to build a few new plants or even a nuclear renaissance? Well, it turns out we tried to have a nuclear renaissance. It got started with nuclear incentives and subsidies in the 2005 Energy Policy Act. 13 utilities came forward with plans for 31 new reactors. How many are online today? 0. Most were canceled before the ground was struck. 4 went forward. In 2017, South Carolina utilities abandoned construction on 2 reactors at the VC Summer plant after $9 billion was spent. They were facing a ballooning $21 billion price tag and schedule delays. That failed nuclear project is 18% of customers' electric bills. Right now, that hurts. Today, there are only 2 nuclear reactors under construction in the US at Plant Vogtle in Georgia. Their promise? $14 billion and finished by 2017. Now the 2 Georgia reactors cost $28 billion, twice as much, and they're still not finished. Rebar had to be redone. Inspections found 80% component failure rates. What were the federal subsidies for Vogtle? $12 billion. Meanwhile, customers in Georgia are already paying for the plant. If Georgia had put that money into wind and solar energy, it could have generated 3 to 5 times as much carbon-free power every year. And wind and solar projects go up quickly. In this climate emergency, we just don't have time for high capital cost, lengthy, uncertain nuclear projects. Okay, there is a lot of buzz about what's called advanced nuclear. These are new proposals promoting very different reactor designs, such as small modular, molten salt, liquid metal, high temperature gas cooled, and pebble bed. But these concepts lack data from a prototype by which to evaluate their safety, reliability, and their economics. Are new advanced reactors economical and ready to scale up? We're far from knowing that yet. There are basic material science questions out there. I argue we need to focus limited energy R&D budget into tech that is ready to be deployed to meet the climate threat. So, in my view, from our lived experience, a US nuclear renaissance is not affordable today. It doesn't seem feasible. Still, let's consider, is a US nuclear renaissance needed? This month, Lawrence Berkeley Lab released a report, Halfway to Zero. Their findings, in the last 15 years, the US power sector has gone 50% of the way to zero carbon emissions. At the same time, consumer and public health costs were lower and jobs were up. Their finding, low carbon solutions are increasingly plentiful and cost effective. That's just astonishingly good news. Existing nuclear, not new nuclear, was a factor. So climate change is a real and present danger, a future we don't want. Nuclear is a low carbon energy resource. Do we need a US nuclear renaissance to avert climate change? In numerous peer-reviewed studies, we find affordable, job-creating pathways to reliable net zero carbon energy that don't rely on a nuclear renaissance. The pillars of these pathways are renewables, energy efficiency, transformation of the grid, electrification of transportation and buildings, energy storage, natural carbon sinks, reducing non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, equity, and jobs. Some of these pathways include existing nuclear reactors chugging along to 2030 or mid-century. That's an uncertainty. It could help, or it could be a lost opportunity. If new nuclear can play a role in a decarbonized power sector after 2050, we'd have to address long-standing issues with nuclear that you just don't have with cheaper alternatives. First, we have to clean up and regulate uranium mining. Second, solve the nuclear waste problem with deep geologic disposal. Third, increase nuclear safety by orders of magnitude. Fourth, address security threats to new nuclear, including cyber. Fifth, don't make the nuclear weapons proliferation problem worse. And finally, prototype and test out new nuclear ideas to get clear on their performance and economics. With renewables and increasingly with storage, we are seeing successful technical innovation, declining costs, and massive deployment. We're just not seeing that in nuclear. To be clear, I'm not arguing to take nuclear off the table. I'm saying new nuclear has to earn its place too. Thus, my conclusion, the US nuclear renaissance is not needed, nor is it affordable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. McKinsey. I wanted to give Mr. Schellenberger an opportunity for a 5 or so minute response, and then we'll go back to you.
That sounds great. Thanks so much for the chance to have this conversation. Let's just start with NRDC's role in this. So NRDC has significant investments in natural gas and solar panels through BlackRock, which is known as a shadow bank because it's not regulated according to the standards of other banks. Grist, the environmental magazine, and others have investigated NRDC over the years, and they've discovered significant investment in natural gas. And that means a conflict of interest when it comes to shutting down nuclear plants in California. To give you a sense of it, when NRDC is succeeding in shutting down a nuclear plant in New York called Indian Point, it produces about $8 billion with a B in revenue annually. A lot of natural gas and solar investors are going to make money on that. But rather than lobby transparently for their own financial interests, they fund groups like NRDC who hide their donations behind federal rules, and then they turn around and make their own investments in natural gas and solar. I would note that Matthew never addressed this fundamental question of solar panels in China. This is not a small issue. This is a major question. We have gone every awards show from Hollywood over the last 50 years. People have gotten up and brayed about never again. Many of NRDC's best supporters, like Leonardo DiCaprio, other Hollywood supporters have said never again. Here we are confronted with a genocide by the Chinese government against the Uyghur Muslims who are being forced to make solar panels. And NRDC has not even made a statement on this. It has not called for banning these panels coming in from China. It's pretty shocking, honestly. I'm writing a follow-up column to the one I wrote today about this decision to support shutting down nuclear plants, killing thousands of high-wage jobs in the United States, and attempting to replace them with natural gas, including potential donors to NRDC, and solar panels made in genocidal conditions in China. This is not something that Mr. McKinsey can just walk away and pretend like it's not an issue. When I testified in front of the Senate about a month ago, Senator Mark Kelly, the former astronaut, acknowledged to me after I had raised this issue that solar panels are extremely problematic, and the Senate is looking into whether or not it should ban the importation of these solar panels. So where would Mr. McKinsey even get the renewables he's talking about? He goes through some just cherry picking of numbers, which NRDC is legendary for. Let's just look at the subsidies. Renewable subsidies have always gotten significantly more than nuclear for the last 50 years. Everybody finds the same thing. It's only propaganda outfits that suggest something different. This is the best available data compiled by the US Energy Information Agency and you can see in the sources and notes, I've given all of the data there so people can check it on their own, put together by the Congressional Research Service. This is the best available scientific data. These are the comparative subsidies for different energy sources. This is what it was in New Jersey. So let's just take a look at NRDC here. This is an organization that is heavily invested in the energy technologies that they want to replace nuclear with. They have fought to shut down nuclear plants. We're at 20% nuclear. If we were at 75% nuclear like France, there would be no need for NRDC. What is NRDC's role? To reduce pollution from fossil fuel power plants. Well, if you don't have fossil fuel power plants, you don't need NRDC. You just have clean electricity that doesn't produce any power. People are always like, oh yeah, we get involved in a lot of air pollution regulations. Well, why would you have air pollution if you're using nuclear power? You wouldn't. And therefore you wouldn't have a need for groups like NRDC. That's why they're on the rampage to shut down nuclear. We're supposed to go from 20% to 75%. You know why we didn't? Because of NRDC, Sierra Club, and don't take my word for it. Read the best available historical studies. University of Wisconsin. I mean, these are major PhD theses that got turned into studies, studying at a grassroots level how NRDC, Ralph Nader, Sierra Club, Jerry Brown just terrified the living daylights out of people, convincing people that nuclear power plants could go off like weapons, irresponsible misinformation for decades. So I don't think it's really any surprise that we have to sit here and listen to Mr. McKinsey justify what is really unethical policies on the part of NRDC to shut down nuclear plants on the behest of financial interests, powerful financial interests, while then claiming to somehow be an organization that's concerned about the natural environment.
All right, Mr. McKinsey, about 5 minutes for a response, and then we can move on to some questions from myself and the audience.
Okay, great. Let me just bring us back to our proposition that we're debating in this event. Is a U.S. nuclear renaissance needed and affordable? That's the question that we're here to answer. So, Mr. Schellenberger raised a number of issues, including safety and subsidies and the closure of specific reactors. I'd like to focus on those. So, nuclear safety is a challenge when you consider increasing the quantity of nuclear energy in a decarbonized power sector. Fallout from a severe nuclear accident is dangerous and costly. What are the potential consequences of a nuclear accident? Lives lost, sickness, displacement, environmental damage, and financial costs. The Fukushima accident has had a staggering price tag. Hundreds of billions of dollars, it may approach $1 trillion. 30 to 40 years of cleanup work. For nuclear energy to work, you need both an ideal functioning technical system that has to be married to an ideal functioning regulatory system. In Japan, ultimately, the Fukushima accident was attributed to human error. In a safety culture and for technology that's akin to what we have in the US, that's what was shocking. At 3 Mile Island in 1979 in Pennsylvania, Thank goodness containment held. The radiation was contained in the reactor containment structure after the accident. But overnight, $1 billion asset turned into $1 billion liability. That was frightening just from a financial perspective and speaks to the business model of nuclear. A couple of more thoughts in my response time on baseload. So the fact that we have variable generation from renewables, the flat statement that we need baseload for reliability is not correct. We need hour by hour to match electricity demand with production. With variable generation and a smart grid, you can go a very long way, and it tells you how much storage you need. Moving on to Texas, which Mr. Schellenberger raised, we're still learning a lot about the catastrophic outage in Texas. What's clear is that major factors were poor planning, interdependence of electricity, water, and natural gas, and energy inefficient building stock that made people more vulnerable. And important, the relative isolation of the Texas power grid. The majority of generating resources that went offline were natural gas. In my opening remarks, I talked about the different pillars that go into a comprehensive policy addressing climate change. The power sector is one of those pillars, and one we can seize on in the next 10 years to reach 50% carbon emissions reductions by 2030. But it's not the only pillar you need to work on. On Germany and coal, the anti-nuclear movement in Germany, it's got a long history. It's deeply rooted in German society. It's not simply a reaction to Fukushima. It's a societal choice. Over the last decade, Germany's had both a coal and nuclear phase out that is working. Fossil is down 93.6 terawatt hours. Nuclear is down 65.6 terawatt hours in production. Renewables are up by 139 terawatt hours. Finally, if I may, on nuclear waste, I'll just say that consistently, we haven't been able to manage the nuclear fuel cycle. That includes everything from uranium mining to fuel manufacturing to what to do with the waste. The uranium mining problem is still a severe environmental condition. The Navajo people are exposed to 200 million tons of uranium mine waste that's not remediated, polluted water, radon-contaminated houses. The waste produced by nuclear power plants is toxic and dangerous and has to be isolated for many thousands of years. It is an intergenerational problem. And finally, for nuclear's business model, waste is a big deal. And for new nuclear especially, a community hosting a new reactor would also have to agree to be a de facto nuclear waste dump. So I'll just say in conclusion, my organization, NRDC, our objective is to get off fossil fuels, and everything about our work is consistent with that. Thank you.
Right, thank you. I was going to start with a few questions from myself, and I see we also have many questions coming in from the audience, so we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. Mr. Schellenberger, I wanted to start with a question for you. Many would argue that nuclear power plants have not been closing, at least in recent years, over hysteria, but because simply of their inability to compete in the electric power bidding market and their kind of general lack of flexibility under certain scenarios. And as well, their inability sometimes to compete with renewables and natural gas as cheaper energy sources. So, in light of these changes, now there's legislation being proposed. I think Senator Manchin is working on this to have some federal government aid to support these large scale nuclear reactors and try to prevent them from shutting down. My question for you is, why should we subsidize nuclear power generation if other sources, including renewables, are often more affordable and more economic?
Well, the short answer is because nuclear power keeps us safe. I mean, the primary purpose of nuclear energy is as a weapon. I mean, that's really why so many people at NRDC are against it. And groups like NRDC favored unilateral disarmament. They favored getting rid of our nuclear weapons. Much of this just comes out of that. It's just a kind of new left reaction from the 60s that thinks that we can get rid of nuclear energy. Everybody knows we can't, because fission comes out of science at a lab level. It's this incredible responsibility to be responsible for nuclear energy. We can't get rid of it. Like, even if you killed every physicist in the world, the continuing progress of humanity would mean that somebody would figure out how to split atoms. So you can sit there and go, oh my God, we just have to make it go away because it's so scary or whatever. Like, no, that's actually, nuclear weapons have been what has made America safe since World War II. It's how we protect our allies in Europe. It's how we protect our allies in Asia. You shut down your nuclear plants and you dry up the entire supply chain, including the workers who can keep you safe. So even if you are a climate denier and you don't believe in climate change, or you really don't care about it, like NRDC, nonetheless, you have to recognize that we need nuclear energy just for national security reasons. But let me just address, Matthew has
I respond on that?
Every single point that I made. No, I'm not done yet. Matthew conceded every single point I made, including the fact that NRDC is funded by natural gas companies, that it's invested in natural gas companies, that it has said nothing about the genocide in China. He has not addressed the fact that if you don't have polluting power plants, you don't need NRDC. And so NRDC is against the kind of plants that eliminate the need for the kind of regulations that it advocates. So look, nuclear, if you want to make nuclear expensive, which has been what NRDC has tried to do and been doing for 50 years through different market mechanisms and regulations, you can do that. They made it so that the bike racks at nuclear power plants are built differently than the bike racks at coal plants. They've manipulated emotions, particularly fear, to get people to mix up nuclear weapons and power plants. They're not the same. The uranium is enriched at 5% in our nuclear plants. It's over 90% in our bombs. I, as a child of the propaganda of NRDC, believed that when there was a meltdown, and you even heard Matthew say it, he said, oh, the fallout. They're trying to get you to be scared of nuclear plants to make it think like a bomb. They've been doing that for over 50 years. It's manipulative, it's wrong. I think millennials and Zoomers are starting to see through it. So when you kind of ask a reasonable question, what should the policies towards nuclear be? Well, if we care about climate change, clean air, and low and cheap, inexpensive electricity, we should just do what the French did. I mean, the French live the highest living standards in the world with some of the cleanest air in Europe and some of the cheapest power, and it's because they did nuclear rather than fossil fuels. Matthew wants us to follow the German model, which has locked in its coal plants, one of the many misrepresentations on what he said. Germany is not phasing out coal plants. It's keeping its coal plants because it doesn't want to have blackouts like the kind that NRDC policies have resulted in California and Texas.
Mr. McKinsey, or Dr. McKinsey, excuse me, I'll give you a few minutes to respond to that in just 1 second, but I wanted to get a little more specificity from Mr. Schellenberger. If we kind of push aside the issues you brought up with the NRDC and sort of with the history of hysteria around nuclear power, which is certainly granted. Again, I want to ask you about the economics of nuclear power in a lot of states, especially as renewable energy sources such as solar and wind continue to scale up. You know, the cost of electricity generation from these sources, per gigawatt hour continues to go down.
No, it doesn't. Is there ignoring all the data I showed you? I mean, I showed you the data. The subsidies are lower per unit of energy in all the states that have had the subsidy programs. The places where you've had the cheap solar saw electricity prices go up. That's what happened in California. Prices went up because they deployed a lot of cheap solar. Why? Because you have to build transmission lines, you have to add batteries, you have to add storage. Yes, closing nuclear plants also contributed to the cost increase. But look, here's the thing that conservatives don't get. That thing that I think Buckley types neoliberal conservatives don't get about this. Electricity is a natural monopoly. There's no way around that. It's not a competitive market. If you run out of apples at the supermarket, you can go to the next supermarket. But if you run out of electricity, people die. This is about civilization. It's about whether you're in favor of civilization, having reliable energy and electricity or not. And so I think conservatives have gotten themselves confused and manipulated by groups like NRDC, which try to use the language of markets, but then they go and subsidize solar and wind at these ridiculous levels, making all the competitors uncompetitive. I mean, that's the short version of, I think, the answer to what you're talking about, which is that because NRDC has constructed manipulated markets through federal subsidies for wind that date back to 1992, they have made it so that they have basically, and they've obviously sought to not just deny nuclear similar subsidies, they've also sought to ratchet the cost of operating nuclear plants through various unnecessary things that NRDC is specialist at devising. So, I mean, that's the bottom line of it. The markets are what you make them. If nuclear were so expensive, then France would be poor. And French electricity would be more expensive than German electricity, and that's not the case.
Hey, Mr. McKinsey, I'll give you a few minutes to respond to the last several responses from Mr. Schellenberger.
Yeah, I want to get back to our debate topic. So we're thinking about what a big growth in nuclear energy would look like, how that could relate to addressing the climate change problem. Is it needed? Is it affordable? That's our debate proposition. And Mr. Schellenberger brought up the really important issue of nuclear weapons proliferation. The fact that intrinsically the technology to build a nuclear energy program is related to the technology to build nuclear weapons. The skill sets overlap, the facilities overlap, and importantly, the materials overlap. So if we think about new nuclear in the future, and right now, today, about the R&D that would go into that, we have to be very careful to not make the nuclear weapons proliferation problem any worse. Like climate change, nuclear weapons do pose an existential threat. They still do. And we have to limit the nuclear weapons proliferation potential of any advanced nuclear energy technologies. On subsidies, I'll say that in aggregate, nuclear subsidies have far outweighed the subsidies to renewables or storage or hydrogen or any other technologies that we really need to develop as part of the great task of addressing climate change. Perhaps one of the biggest subsidies for nuclear and what makes it viable economically is something called the Price-Anderson Act. The fact that that the public would be responsible for the extreme costs of a severe nuclear accident like we saw in Fukushima. Thank you. I'll make sure we have time for more questions.
On the issue of Price-Anderson, because that's just misinformation.
Thank you, Mr. Schellenberger. We're going to have to move on to another question here because we have such few time. So a question that just came in from an audience member, it says, and this is for both of you, I'm curious about the international impact of nuclear energy. How should we take into account the fact that Europe is reliant on Russian fuel and that US power currently backs the oil trade?
Yeah, this is a major issue. And it's a similar problem in the United States, which is that if NRDC gets its way and shuts down all of our nuclear plants and all of our coal plants, guess what one single fuel will be dependent on? Gas, full stop. And that's very dangerous. It's very dangerous. And I don't even really have to, you don't need to be an energy expert to understand why. Everybody understands why you don't be dependent on a single fuel. I've been working to shut down coal plants for about 30 years of my career. But I told senators that if groups like NRDC are going to get their way and they're going to shut down all of our nuclear plants, you better not shut down your coal plants too, or we'll be at the mercy of the gas guys. And maybe that's what NRDC wants. Similar problem in Europe. You see basically the Germans are keeping their coal plants online because they don't want to become overly dependent on Russian gas. That's very dangerous. It means that when Putin wants to invade Crimea or Ukraine or whatever, and Germany or somebody else wants to go, oh, hey, maybe don't invade other countries, Putin can kind of be like, I'll mess with the supply, which he's already shown a willingness to do. So it's extremely dangerous. This is why Europeans know, this is why Emmanuel Macron, who's the most important leader in Europe and certainly one of the most important leaders in the world, has defended nuclear from NRDC's allies in the Green Party in France, who want to shut down nuclear power and basically weaken Western Europe from within. So it's a very important question that was raised, and that is maybe the most important reason for nuclear in Europe. Dr.
McKinsey, feel free to take a few minutes.
Yeah, the international context for nuclear energy, it goes beyond our debate, which was, is the US nuclear renaissance needed and affordable? But the global context for nuclear energy and climate change, it is a really important issue. And so one thing to think about is what nuclear technologies could scale up globally to address climate change. Would that be safe from perspective of reactor accidents, from proliferation, and would nuclear newcomer countries have the resources to put together all the infrastructure that you need to safely, reliably manage nuclear energy? These are big, outstanding questions. And nuclear's, certainly not suited to many contexts where you have energy need that is better suited by distributed and storage solutions. So I'll just say one other thing about the international context of nuclear. We're seeing nuclear reactors being built in other countries, China and Russia, for example, but we're seeing them struggle with some of the same issues in terms of cost overruns and schedule delays on nuclear projects. And in China particularly, we're seeing a competition, economic competition between nuclear and renewables that is trending towards renewables. And so the global picture on nuclear energy, I would say, has many of the same complexities that we're seeing here in the United States, many of the same hurdles to cost-effective, reliable, carbon-free technology that we see here too.
So, Mr. McKinsey, I wanted to pick up on another question here. If we truly are to achieve our goals of decarbonization with renewables only and without nuclear, it seems that looking to Germany, for example, would be a good idea. And at least in recent years, I think they've set this target of 3.5 additional kilowatt hours per year of renewable energy. And arguably, Germany's march towards renewables has been the most ambitious of any nation in the world, and they've barely been able to meet a fifth of that goal so far. So, if we are to, stay below the 1.5 degrees, as outlined in the AR5 and in the special report from the IPCC about the 1.5 degree increase, then, how should what should convince us that renewables alone can bring us to that point within the span of a few decades, when the best example of that in the world, being Germany, seems to suggest that that's a very impractical goal to have without the help of nuclear.
Yeah. In my opening remarks, I wasn't excluding nuclear. I was saying that nuclear needs to be considered from its cost perspectives as a low carbon energy solution. And there are many other components to the tough job of addressing climate change than the power sector. Decarbonizing the power sector is something we should do first to have a front-loaded strategy to address climate change. But as I mentioned, there are other pillars in the pathway: energy efficiency, transformation of the grid, electrification of transportation and buildings, energy storage, natural carbon sinks. There are many components, or wedges, if you would, to addressing climate change. And most of the peer-reviewed literature on paths to a low carbon 50% reductions by 2030, decarbonization by 2050, there is some role for existing nuclear, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. And so, an open question is, can we safely, reliably continue existing nuclear operation to mid-century? But if you ask what's next for nuclear, I'd say it's an open question right now. We don't have anything in the pipeline that has been prototyped that we have data on its reliability and cost and safety.
Thank you. Mr. Schellenberg, I want to give you a few minutes to respond.
I mean, NRDC is trying to shut down nuclear power plants right now in California, in New York, Illinois. They've got very high paid lobbyists. When you bring in over $100 million a year, you can buy the best lobbyists, the best misinformation specialists. NRDC is actively lobbying to shut down Diablo Canyon in California right now. They were behind the advocacy to shut it down. They succeeded. we've now seen Union of Concerned Scientists, which, like NRDC, is one of the leading anti-nuclear groups from the 70s, has now put out it's a rats leaving the ship, put out an email and an analysis saying, looks like Diablo Canyon might be replaced by natural gas. You think? The New York Times last week published an article about how Indian Point nuclear plant in New York is being shut down and replaced by natural gas, thanks to NRDC. So, I mean, Matthew's sitting here going, gosh, I don't know. I mean, maybe there's some technology, some nuclear technology that could work. What are you talking about? You guys are actively shutting down nuclear plants that exist and run safely now. I saw one of the questions somebody—
I have to say that your
finish?
information is not accurate, Michael.
Sorry,
No,
sorry, excuse me to both of you. We have to not interrupt each other, and we also have to maintain a level of respect
Very well.
in light of what William F. Buckley would always do on his show Firing Line. So please proceed, Mr. Schellenberger.
Thank you. And unfortunately, I lost my train of thought. You know, I mean,
it was Diablo Canyon, Indian Point.
Thank you. You know, look, someone asked a question about, they said, how long has France had 75% of the electricity from nuclear? They did a scale up of nuclear in the 60s and 70s, the same kind of plants we had. We had a very small accident at 3 Mile Island. It was a small meltdown. It's like a jet plane going down. If you look at jet plane travel from World War II until today, it goes up and up and up, and the deaths go down and down and down. It's the same thing with nuclear. It's a complicated new technology. We had to get good at using it. That's just what happens. And so we had some early problems, but France has never had a meltdown. So France, when you say how many deaths has France had from nuclear, I mean, I guess somebody probably had like some shelving fall on them and they might have died, or they might have been hit by a car at one of the plants, but we haven't had accidents like that at France. So it's shocking when you realize that something so powerful and that is the basis for our national defense is also potential to make electricity that doesn't hurt anybody ever. It's shocking. It's hard to believe. And I think that what we've seen is groups preying on that misperception.
Thank you.
I'm afraid
sorry, Mr. or Dr. McKenzie, we're approaching the end, so I want to make sure I give each of you a few minutes.
1 minute.
And we'll be running just a few minutes over here on our time to provide a brief closing statement. And since we started with Mr. Schellenberger, we'll start closing statements with you, Dr. McKenzie.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm afraid Mr. Schellenberger has not injected enough truth into our conversation today, enough factual basis for us to really consider his side of the perspective on our proposition. The U.S. nuclear renaissance is needed and affordable. I've argued, based on our lived experience in the United States, that nuclear energy, a low carbon resource, has not demonstrated it's affordable, and that we have alternative pathways to zero that don't rely on nuclear energy. The existing nuclear reactors I talked about in my opening statement, the state subsidies to extend their lives because of their low carbon attributes, NRDC is engaged on this. We have best practices, principles that we put forward in terms of these subsidies that included financial transparency, time limits, assurances of safety, and importantly, when inevitably these reactors close, their replacement by energy efficiency, renewables, and other clean resources that can get us to zero. On Diablo Canyon was going to shut down in 2018. It was a hard stop due to thermal pollution and the state government's water permitting process. NRDC joined with PG&E and labor and the community to come up with a deal to extend Diablo Canyon's operational time for another 9 years. And so, to characterize us as our objective is to shut down nuclear plants is just not accurate. Our objective is to address the threat of climate change, where safe continued nuclear operation can contribute to that while we plan out for their inevitable retirement and a low carbon future. That's our objective there. And so just in a conclusion, I want to say that today is significant because the Biden administration has announced its commitment under the Paris Accord. I saw that nuclear was mentioned once in this commitment. And to the extent that our country continues to invest in nuclear energy, I just want to make sure that the principles I outlined, cleaning up the mess that we've made so far, increasing safety, addressing the non-proliferation problem, and prototyping designs to make sure that they're safe, reliable, and economic, I put forward that those are good principles to proceed with on nuclear policy. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. McKenzie, and Mr. Schellenberger, you may proceed with your closing statement.
And can you just give me a time limit just so I can watch the...
2 minutes. I know we're a few minutes over, but 2 minutes would be ideal.
Okay. So when I was 12 years old, in 1983, I saw the made-for-TV movie about a nuclear war. It scared the living daylights out of me. That is, you can't understand nuclear and climate change outside the context of fear of nuclear. But if you're a millennial generation or Zoomers, you didn't grow up with anything close to that fear. And you can see that nuclear energy is not going away as much as groups like NRDC would want us to. NRDC has had a strategy since the 70s to deny that they want to shut down nuclear plants in order to seem more reasonable. They have been consistent in shutting them down. And that's why we have a climate change challenge to deal with. If we have French levels of nuclear, we don't need fossil fuels at all. Or you can do very small amounts. That's how we're going to electrify transportation. That's where the heating and cooking energies will come from nuclear power. The only way we know how to radically decarbonize is with nuclear. The only way we know how to do it cheaply is with nuclear. All you need to know is France and Germany, those two things standing together. I mentioned in my initial talk that NRDC had invented this idea of thermal pollution, for which there is zero science. The idea is that the hot water that comes out of nuclear plants is somehow bad. That has now made it into The Simpsons. So people think that somehow it causes three-eyed fish. That's how far the science has gone in terms of nuclear. Nuclear's not that complicated, guys. We know how to split atoms. We've been doing it for a long time. It's just a new way of making heat. Everything else in the plant is just like the other plants. There's nothing magical or mysterious about it beyond the miracle of fission itself. And that's an important responsibility for us to have, guys. We can't be trying to ignore it and hope it goes away, or imagine that if we shut down all of our nuclear plants that somehow we're not going to have nuclear weapons. We need to grow up and accept that we have this incredible responsibility. It's a moral responsibility, a spiritual responsibility, and we should make the most of it. We can use nuclear power to create a kind of civilization where everybody is lifted out of poverty and the human environmental footprint shrinks to close to zero. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you. On behalf of the Buckley program, I want to thank both of our guests, Matthew McKenzie and Michael Schellenberger, for taking the time to join the Buckley program today. It was a wonderful event, and I certainly learned a lot. So thank you for joining, and we hope you can join us for future events.